Commander Marcus Cole had learned to stand in shadows. It was not because he was afraid of the light or because he lacked courage in battle, but because the jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw made important people uncomfortable. When they looked at him, the scar told stories that politicians preferred to forget, wars that generals wanted to bury in classified files, that diplomats wished had never happened. So Marcus stood at the back of the delegation hall, half hidden behind the massive frames of the Centauri ambassadors who towered nearly 8 feet tall and blocked him from view. Quite effectively, this was by design, and Marcus did not mind it one bit. Today was supposed to be historic. The Velathari Empire had finally agreed to formal negotiations after nearly 100 years of cold silence between their species and humanity. Their crystalline ships hung in orbit above the capital city of New Geneva like frozen storms waiting to break. And their queen herself would set foot on human soil for the first time in recorded history. Marcus had been assigned to this event as a security afterthought. He was a decorated veteran of the Proxima conflict, where he had earned medals and commendations and that terrible scar. But those days of glory had passed now. The United Terran Council shuffled him into ceremonial positions where his face would not appear in photographs or news broadcasts. He was a reminder of things they wanted forgotten, and so they kept him hidden. Marcus accepted this fate with the quiet dignity of a soldier who understood that wars were fought by men, but remembered by politicians. The delegation hall was magnificent in its design, with soaring ceilings of transparent aluminum that showed the alien ships floating above like silent judges. Hundreds of dignitaries filled the space, including presidents and premiers and generals and admirals from every human colony world. They wore their finest uniforms and their most expensive suits, and their faces carried expressions of carefully practiced diplomacy. Everyone wanted to make a good impression on the alien queen. Everyone wanted to be the one she noticed. Everyone wanted to be part of history. Massive doors at the far end of the hall began to part with a sound like distant thunder, and the entire assembly fell into immediate silence. Marcus watched from his position in the shadows as the Velathari delegation entered. He had seen images of the alien species before in military briefings and intelligence reports, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of their presence. They moved like liquid light given form. The queen walked at the center of her guards, and she was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed in all his years of service. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a body covered in iridescent chitin that shifted colors as she moved, flowing through shades of blue and purple and silver like oil on water. Bioluminescent tendrils cascaded from her head like living hair, pulsing with soft inner light and patterns that seemed almost like a language. Her face was angular and strange, with compound eyes that held thousands of facets, each one reflecting a different shade of violet. She moved with absolute grace and total confidence, and an authority that needed no announcement. Every human in the room bowed or saluted according to their station. The ambassadors offered formal greetings in the Velathari tongue, which they had spent months learning for this occasion. The generals stood at rigid attention, with respect they usually reserved only for their own commanders. Marcus simply watched. He had no role to play here except to observe and protect if needed. And so he observed with the careful attention of a man who had survived many battles by noticing things that others missed. The queen acknowledged the greetings with small gestures of her 4-fingered hands, but her compound eyes were moving across the crowd in a pattern that seemed almost like searching. She was looking for something or someone. The formal procession continued toward the central platform where the official ceremony would take place. But suddenly, the queen stopped walking. Her royal guards tensed immediately, their hands moving toward weapons that Marcus could not see but knew must exist. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The queen changed direction. She walked past the president of the United Terran Council without even glancing at him. She moved around the admiral of the combined fleet as if he were furniture. She ignored the ambassadors and the diplomats and the generals who had spent their careers preparing. For this moment, she walked directly toward the back of the room, toward the shadows, toward Marcus Cole. Felt his heart begin to beat faster, but he did not move from his position, because soldiers learn not to react until they understand the situation. Queen stopped directly in front of him, and her compound eyes examined his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking through his skin into his very soul. Her guards formed a protective wall around them both, separating this strange encounter from the confused and frightened dignitaries who could not understand what was happening. Marcus looked up at the alien queen and waited. One of her delicate hands rose slowly toward his face. Her fingers were long and graceful, with an extra joint that allowed them to move in ways human fingers could not. Marcus did not flinch, because soldiers learn not to flinch, even when they do not understand what is happening. Her touch was cool against his skin, almost electric, like the feeling before a lightning storm when the air itself seems to hum with energy. Her fingers traced the ridge of his scar with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a being so powerful and alien. She touched the place where it began near his temple. She followed its path down across his cheek. She traced it to where it ended at his jawbone. Then she spoke. Her voice was not like any sound Marcus had ever heard. It was a harmonic chord that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate somewhere deep in his chest, like music felt rather than heard. The words formed in his mind with perfect clarity, even though his ears could not process the sounds that carried them. "I never thought I'd see you again." Marcus felt the pomber world tilt beneath his feet. He had never met this alien queen. He had never visited Velathari space. He had never even seen one of her kind in person before this very moment, and yet she looked at him with eyes that held recognition and something that might have been wonder or joy or sorrow, or all of these things combined. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "I believe you have mistaken me for someone else." The queen did not remove her hand from his face. Her compound eyes continued to study him with that terrible intensity. "No," she said in that voice that was not quite a voice. "I have made no mistake. Marcus Cole of the vessel Prometheus Rising." The name hit him like a physical blow. Prometheus Rising. Everyone in human space knew that name. It was a colonial transport ship carrying 5,000 souls that had vanished without a trace 16 years ago during the height of tensions between humanity and the Velathari Empire. The disappearance had nearly sparked an interstellar war. Both sides had blamed each other. Both sides had armed themselves for a conflict that somehow never came. And Marcus Cole had been on that ship. He had been 12 years old. He had been traveling with his parents to a new colony world, and he was the only survivor. He remembered nothing of what had happened, only waking up in a human hospital with a ruined face and a gap in his memory that no doctor could explain. "How do you know that name?" Marcus whispered. The queen leaned closer, and her voice dropped to something almost tender. "Because I was the one who saved you." The revelation that emerged from that private chamber should have destroyed everything. 100 years of Cold War between humanity and the Velathari Empire had been built on a foundation of mutual suspicion and blame. Both sides had spent fortunes building weapons and training soldiers and preparing for a conflict that they believed was inevitable. Both sides had taught their children to fear and distrust the other. Both sides had pointed to the destruction of the Prometheus Rising as proof that the enemy could not be trusted, and now a single conversation threatened to pull that entire foundation apart. The politicians wanted to bury the story immediately. They gathered in emergency sessions and whispered about the damage it would cause if the truth became known, about how their own people would react to learning that a century of fear had been based on a lie. The generals wanted to verify every detail before making any decisions. They demanded access to Velathari records and independent confirmation, and anything else that might prove or disprove the queen's claims. The media had already caught wind that something extraordinary had happened, and they wanted answers that no one was willing to give. Chaos spread through the diplomatic complex like fire to dry grass, but Marcus Cole was done standing in shadows, had spent his entire adult life following orders and accepting assignments and letting other people decide where he should be and what he should do. He had watched from the back of rooms while politicians made decisions that affected billions of lives. He had kept quiet when he disagreed, because that was what soldiers were supposed to do. Not anymore. Marcus requested permission to address the joint assembly of human and Velathari dignitaries. The request was denied immediately by officials who feared what he might say. Oh, he walked into the assembly chamber anyways. Security forces moved to stop him, but something in his eyes made them hesitate, and that hesitation was all he needed. He strode to the central platform where only the most important speakers were allowed, and he stood before the gathered representatives of two civilizations. "My name is Marcus Cole," he said, and his voice carried through the chamber with a strength that surprised even himself. "I am a commander in the United Terran Defense Force and a veteran of the Proxima conflict and a survivor of the Prometheus Rising." The room fell silent. "I have spent my entire adult life preparing to fight an enemy," Marcus continued. "I have trained with weapons designed to kill Velathari. I have studied tactics for wars against their fleets. I have earned medals and commendations for actions taken in the name of defending humanity against a threat that I was told was real and imminent and existential." He paused and touched the scar on his face. "And now I have learned that the reason I am alive to do any of those things is because a scared alien girl could not let a scared human boy die alone." On a frozen moon, murmurs rippled through the assembly, but Marcus pressed on before anyone could interrupt. "The Prometheus Rising was not destroyed by Velathari weapons," he said. "It was torn apart by a random gravitational anomaly that cared nothing for politics or species or the 5,000 lives it ended in an instant. There was no attack. There was no act of war. There was only a cosmic accident and a child princess who chose compassion over caution." He turned to face the Velathari delegation, where Queen Saritha sat watching him with those compound eyes that held 1,000 reflections. "Your people did not murder 5,000 humans," Marcus said directly to her. "You did not start this Cold War that has defined our civilizations for a century, and your queen is not a monster or an enemy. She is the reason I exist." Then he turned to face his own people. "And we have spent 100 years preparing for a war against shadows," he said. "We have taught our children to hate beings they have never met. We have built weapons capable of destroying worlds. We have sacrificed resources that could have fed the hungry and healed the sick and expanded our reach to the stars. All because we needed someone to blame for a tragedy that had no villain." The silence in the chamber was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. "I am not a diplomat," he admitted. "I do not know how to craft treaties or negotiate agreements or navigate the complex dance of interstellar politics. I am a soldier, and I know how to fight and how to kill and how to survive. But I also know this." He looked down at the assembled dignitaries from both civilizations. "I should have died on that moon 16 years ago. Every person in this room knows the survival statistics for a child exposed to vacuum with the injuries I sustained. But I did not die because someone looked at me and saw something worth saving. A Velathari princess with every reason to leave me there and no reason at all to risk herself, found a dying human child and chose to spend 3 days fighting to keep him alive. She used her own medical supplies and her own technology and her own strength to save a creature that her people had been taught to fear and distrust. And then she let me go because she knew that keeping me would have caused more harm than good." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not care. "That is the enemy we have been preparing to fight," he said. "That is the monster we have been teaching our children to hate. A young girl who could not let a child die alone in the dark. I am not asking anyone in this room to forget the past, or to pretend that our civilizations do not have real differences and real conflicts. I am asking you to consider the possibility that we have been wrong. I am asking you to imagine what we might have accomplished if we had spent the last century building bridges instead of weapons. I am asking you to look at Queen Sarita and see what I see. Not an alien or an enemy or a threat to be neutralized, but a person who once made a choice that changed everything. He stepped back from the central platform, and the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then Queen Sarita rose from her seat. She walked slowly to stand beside Marcus, and her bioluminescent tendrils pulsed with light that seemed almost warm. "My people have a saying," she said in that harmonic voice that everyone could feel in their bones. "The universe is vast and cold and filled with darkness. But we do not have to be. I saved a human child because in that moment I chose to be something other than what the universe demanded. I chose warmth over cold. I chose light over darkness. I chose compassion over indifference." She looked at Marcus with those compound eyes that held 1,000 memories. "And I have spent 16 years wondering if that choice mattered at all. Today I have my answer." She turned to face the assembly. "The commander is correct that our civilizations have real differences and real conflicts that cannot be wished away with pretty words. But he is also correct that we have wasted a century preparing for a war that was built on misunderstanding. I do not know if peace between our peoples is possible, but I know that it is worth trying. And I know that this man standing beside me is proof that even the smallest act of kindness can echo across years and light years and change the course of history." The chamber exploded into noise as everyone tried to speak at once, but Marcus barely heard any of it. Was looking at Sarita and remembering dreams of gentle hands, and a voice like music telling him that he would not die alone, and, for the first time since he was a frightened child on a frozen moon, he believed that the universe might not be as cold as it seemed. The delegation hall erupted into chaos the moment the Queen finished speaking those impossible words. Security forces from both sides moved to intervene as diplomats shouted questions and generals reached for communication devices, and journalists who had been observing from the gallery began transmitting frantic reports to every corner of human space. But the Queen simply raised one hand, and her guards formed an impenetrable barrier around herself and Marcus, their bodies creating a wall of iridescent chitin that no human weapon could easily breach. "We require privacy," the Queen announced in that harmonic voice that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard it. "This matter concerns the very foundation of relations between our peoples, and it will not be discussed in a room full of recording devices." The President of the United Terran Council stepped forward with diplomatic protests ready on his lips, but something in the Queen's compound eyes made him stop before he could speak. This was not a request. Within an hour, Marcus found himself in a private chamber deep within the diplomatic complex, seated across from the alien Queen with only a handful of essential personnel present. The room was small and simple, with white walls and a single table between them. There were no windows and no recording devices that anyone could detect. The Queen had insisted on these conditions, and the humans had agreed because they had no other choice. Marcus studied the alien monarch and tried to make sense of what was happening. His entire body felt like it was humming with tension, and his scar seemed to pulse with phantom pain, as if it remembered something his conscious mind could not access. "You said you saved me," Marcus began carefully, "but I have no memory of ever meeting you or any of your kind before today. That is because I removed those memories," the Queen replied without any trace of shame or apology in her voice. "It was necessary to protect you and to protect both of our peoples from a truth that neither side was ready to accept. She leaned back in her chair, and her bioluminescent tendrils pulsed with soft blue light as she gathered her thoughts. "My name is Siritha," she said. "And 16 of your years ago, I was not yet a queen, but merely a princess. Barely past my first molting years, Marcus listened as she told her story. She had been young and reckless and desperate to prove herself worthy of the crown she would one day inherit against the explicit orders of her mother, the reigning queen. Siritha had taken a small scout vessel beyond Velithari borders to explore uncharted space. It was foolish and dangerous, and exactly the sort of thing that young royals throughout history have always done. She had been scanning an uninhabited moon in a system that humans called Kepler 442, when her sensors detected something impossible: massive amounts of wreckage scattered across the frozen surface of the moon like the bones of some great metal beast she had landed to investigate, and found the remains of a human vessel, the Prometheus Rising. The ship had not been destroyed by weapons, Siritha explained, and her voice carried a weight of old grief that surprised Marcus. There were no blast marks or energy signatures or any evidence of attack by my people or any other. She paused, and her compound eyes seemed to look through Marcus into some distant memory. It was a gravitational anomaly, a wandering micro-singularity that had passed through the system at precisely the wrong moment and torn your ship apart with tidal forces that no hull could withstand. Marcus felt his hands trembling, and he pressed them flat against the table to steady himself. 5,000 people, he said quietly. 5,000 people, Siritha confirmed. All dead in an instant from a random cosmic accident that no one could have predicted or prevented. She had searched the wreckage for hours, Siritha told him, not because she expected to find survivors, but because she felt compelled to bear witness to the tragedy. The universe was vast and cold and filled with dangers that cared nothing for the hopes and dreams of the creatures who traveled through it. The least she could do was remember what had happened here, and then she had found him, a small human child sealed inside an emergency escape pod that had somehow survived the destruction of the ship. Around it, the pod had been damaged, and the child inside was dying, his face torn open by shrapnel and his small body broken in ways that should have been fatal. "You were so small," Siritha said, and her voice softened with the memory. "So fragile compared to my kind, barely larger than my hand when I pulled you from that pod. I wanted to let you die," she admitted. "It would have been easier and safer, and my people would never have known that I had found anything at all, but I could not do it. I looked at your face, and I saw a child who was afraid and alone and dying in the dark, and I could not simply walk away and let the universe claim one more victim." She had carried him back to her ship and used every piece of Velithari medical technology at her disposal to keep him alive. For 3 days she had worked without sleep, repairing his damaged body and healing his ruined face and fighting against death itself to save a creature that her people considered an enemy. "Why?" Marcus asked, and his voice cracked on the word. "Why would you risk so much for a human child?" Siritha was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Because I looked at you and I did not see a human or an enemy or a political complication," she said finally. "I saw a child who needed help, and I had the power to help. And in that moment, nothing else mattered." Marcus touched his scar with fingers that felt numb and distant. "The scar," he said. "The doctors could never explain why it healed the way it did. Velithari medical technology is different from your own," Siritha explained. "I saved your life, but I could not heal you perfectly. The scar was the best I could manage with the equipment I had." She told him the rest of the story after 3 days of fighting to keep him alive. Siritha had faced an impossible choice. She could not bring him home to Velithari space because her people would have seen it as an act of war, or worse, she could not take him to human. space herself because her presence would have triggered the very conflict both sides had been preparing for, so she had done the only thing she could think of. She had found a human patrol route and left him in a repaired escape pod where he would certainly be discovered, and before she let him go, she had used Valathari neural technology to remove his conscious memories of those 3 days. I could not erase everything, Siritha admitted. The deeper mind remembers what the surface forgets. And I suspect you have carried echoes of those days with you ever since Marcus thought of the dreams he had experienced throughout his childhood, dreams of floating in darkness, dreams of gentle hands and a voice like music, dreams of being told that he would not die alone. But why the silence? Marcus demanded, and he felt anger rising in his chest for the first time since this conversation began. Why did you let both our peoples believe we had attacked each other? We nearly went to war over the Prometheus Rising. Millions of lives hung in the balance. Saritha's compound eyes dimmed with what might have been shame. I was a child who had disobeyed her queen, she said quietly. I was afraid of what would happen if I told the truth, afraid that no one would believe me, afraid that my confession would start the very war one had tried to prevent. By the time I had the courage to speak, too many years had passed, and too many lies had hardened into accepted truth. I became queen carrying a secret that could have changed everything, and I was too much of a coward to share it. Marcus stared at her across the table and tried to find words for what he was, feeling anger and gratitude and confusion and sorrow all mixed together in a storm that threatened to overwhelm him. Why? Now, he finally asked. Why reveal this at a diplomatic summit after all these years of silence? Saritha met his eyes, and her bioluminescent tendrils pulsed with a light that seemed somehow sad. Because I am dying, she said simply. My kind do not live as long as yours despite our greater size. And I have perhaps one cycle remaining before my body fails. I could not leave this universe without knowing if the boy I saved had survived. I could not die without seeing what kind of man he had become. Marcus felt tears burning in his eyes, and he did not try to hide them. And what do you see? He asked. Siritha reached across the table and touched his scar. One more time with those gentle alien fingers. I see someone worth saving, she said. The aftermath of Marcus Cole's speech was seismic in ways that no one could have predicted. News of the revelation spread across human space within hours, transmitted by journalists and diplomats and ordinary citizens who had witnessed something they could barely comprehend. The story leaped from world to world like wildfire carried on solar winds. A human soldier saved by an alien queen. A century of Cold War built on a tragic misunderstanding. Single act of compassion that had survived decades of hatred and fear. Some people embraced the truth immediately. They had always suspected that the official story of the Prometheus Rising contained gaps and contradictions, and now they finally understood why they celebrated in the streets of colony worlds and sent messages of support to both Marcus and Queen Saritha. Dared to imagine a future where humanity and the Valathari might find common ground. But others rejected the revelation with violent intensity. Hardliners on the human side declared the entire story a sophisticated deception designed to weaken humanity's defenses against an inevitable Valathari attack. They pointed to the timing of the revelation and the lack of physical evidence and the convenient fact that only 2 people could confirm what had actually happened on that frozen moon. Some called Marcus a traitor who had been manipulated by alien technology. Others accused Queen Saritha of implanting false memories in a vulnerable child and activating them decades later for political advantage. Conspiracy theories bloomed like toxic flowers in the dark spaces of human communication networks. The Valathari faced their own internal conflicts. Some factions embraced Saritha's confession as proof that their species was capable of compassion and mercy. even toward their enemies. Others condemned her for hiding the truth for so long and allowing their civilization to prepare for a war that was based on lies. A small but vocal minority insisted that she should have let the human child die, and that her moment of weakness had endangered their entire species. Assassination attempts began within weeks of the revelation. Marcus survived 3 separate attacks by human extremists who considered him a race traitor and a puppet of alien influence. Siritha faced 2 attempts on her own life by Valathari factions who believed she had betrayed their people by saving a human, and then compounded that betrayal by admitting it publicly. Security forces on both sides worked frantically to protect the 2 individuals who had become symbols of a possible future that many people did not want. But something else was happening, to something quieter and slower and ultimately more powerful than the violence and hatred. People were talking to each other on human colony worlds. Ordinary citizens began questioning the official histories they had been taught since childhood. They wondered why their governments had been so certain about what had happened to the Prometheus Rising, when no evidence had ever been found. They asked why they had spent their entire lives preparing to fight beings they had never actually met in Valathari border stations. Warriors laid down their weapons to hear more about the human who had been saved by their queen. They wanted to understand how such a small and fragile creature could have survived injuries that would have killed one of their own kind. They were curious about the species that produced someone willing to stand before 2 civilizations and tell a truth that could have gotten him killed underground. Networks formed in the spaces between official channels. Humans and Valathari began exchanging messages through hidden communication relays, sharing stories and asking questions and trying to understand each other. It was illegal on both sides and dangerous for everyone involved, but it happened anyway because curiosity and hope are harder to kill than governments like to admit. Marcus visited Siritha every day as the months passed, and her health continued to decline. Her species did not live as long as humans despite their greater size and strength, and her body was beginning to fail in ways that no technology could reverse. They met in a private garden that had been constructed specifically for these visits, filled with plants from both worlds that somehow managed to grow together. Marcus learned things about Valathari culture that no human had ever been taught. He discovered that they created poetry through patterns of bioluminescent light that could take hours to complete and carried emotional depths that human language could not capture. He learned that their young were raised communally in vast nurseries where thousands of children grew together, and that the bond between a Valathari and their nursery siblings was considered more sacred than any other relationship. He found out that they mourned their dead through elaborate rituals of silence that could last for days, and that speaking during mourning was considered one of the most profound insults in their culture. Siritha learned about humanity as well. She listened with fascination as Marcus described human families and the strange, intense bonds that formed between parents and children. She struggled to understand concepts like romantic love and marriage, and the human tendency to form pair bonds that lasted for decades. She was amazed by human art and music and the way that Marcus's species could create beauty from vibrations in the air that her kind could barely perceive. "Your species confuses me," Siritha admitted one evening as they sat together watching the sun set through the transparent walls of the garden. "You are so brief. Your lives measured in mere decades, while mine has stretched across centuries. And yet you burn so brightly," she continued. "You accomplish in your short spans things that my kind would spend 10 lifetimes considering." Marcus smiled at her observation. "Maybe that is why," he said. "We do not have time to waste on half measures or endless deliberation. We know that our lives are short, and so we try to fill them with as much meaning as we can." Siritha's tendrils pulsed with soft blue light as she considered his words. "Is that why you spoke at the assembly?" she asked. "You could have remained silent and let the politicians handle the revelation in their own way. It would have been safer for you. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before he answered. When I was a child, after they found me, and after I could not remember anything that had happened, I used to have this dream. The same dream, over and over. Again, I was floating in darkness, and I was alone, and I was dying. But then there was this light, warm and gentle and somehow comforting, and there was a voice like music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And the voice said something that I could never quite remember when I woke up, something that felt more important than anything I had ever heard. Siritha's compound eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. If her kind could produce them, I told you that you would not die in that darkness. She said quietly, I told you that I would not allow it. Marcus nodded slowly. I did not remember the words consciously, he admitted, but somewhere deep inside me, I always knew that someone had chosen to save me. Someone had looked at me and decided that I was worth the risk. He met her compound eyes with his own. How could I not try to live up to that choice? Siritha reached out and touched his scar one more time with those gentle fingers that had healed him so long ago. You have exceeded every hope I had for the child I saved. She said, you have become someone who matters, someone who changes things, someone who proves that compassion is not weakness. I am grateful that I lived long enough to see it. Marcus felt tears on his face, but he did not wipe them away. How much time do you have left? He asked, even though he was afraid of the answer. Siritha's bioluminescent tendrils dimmed slightly. Weeks perhaps, she said. Maybe less. My body is failing faster than my physicians predicted. She leaned closer to him. But I am not afraid, she said. I have seen what my choice became. I have seen a century of hatred begin to crack under the weight of truth. I have seen my people and yours take the first tentative steps toward understanding. That is more than enough. Marcus took her hand in his own, her alien fingers intertwining with his human ones. I will not let you die alone, he said. Siritha smiled in the way that her kind smiled, a subtle shift in the patterns of light across her face. I know, she said. You are human after all, and your kind does not abandon the people you care about. It is perhaps your greatest strength. Siritha, Queen of the Velathari sovereignty, died on a Tuesday morning. According to Earth Standard Time, Marcus was holding her hand when she passed, his human fingers intertwined with her alien ones, just as they had been during so many conversations. In the garden, over the past months, her bioluminescent tendrils had dimmed to almost nothing in her final hours. The light that had once pulsed with emotion and meaning fading like stars at dawn. The physicians had offered to give them privacy, but Marcus had refused. He had promised that she would not die alone, and he intended to keep that promise in her last moments. Siritha had opened her compound eyes and looked at him with an expression that transcended the differences between their species. The universe is cold, she whispered in that harmonic voice that he had come to love. But we do not have to be. And then she was gone. The light in her tendrils flickered once and faded to darkness. Her grip on his hand relaxed, and Marcus Cole sat alone with the body of the alien queen who had saved his life twice. Once on a frozen moon when he was a dying child, and once again when she gave him a reason to become more than he had ever imagined. He wept without shame or restraint. The funeral was broadcast across both civilizations for the first time in recorded history. Human ships joined the Velathari mourning fleet in orbit around their homeworld. Massive vessels from dozens of colony worlds hung in space alongside crystalline Velathari craft, their running lights dimmed in respect for the fallen queen. Billions watched as Siritha's body was committed to the stars in the traditional manner of her people, her physical form dissolving into light and energy that would eventually become part of new stars and new worlds. Marcus delivered the human eulogy. He stood before cameras that would carry his words to every corner of two civilizations, and he spoke about a young princess who had made a choice that changed everything. He did not pretend that her choice had solved all the problems between their peoples, did not claim that her death would bring instant peace or understanding. He simply told the truth about who she was and what she had done and why it mattered. She was not perfect. Marcus said she made mistakes and kept secrets and allowed fear to guide her actions when courage might have served better. But when it mattered most, when a child was dying alone in the dark, she chose compassion over convenience. She chose hope over fear. She chose to be something better than the universe expected. And that choice echoes still. It was not peace, not yet a century of fear and hatred could not vanish overnight, no matter how powerful the truth that had been revealed. But this. It was a beginning. Marcus retired from military service. 3 months after Siritha's death, he had one final mission to complete with cooperation from the new Velithari queen who had inherited the throne from Siritha. Marcus led an expedition to the frozen moon of Kepler 442b, where the Prometheus rising had met its end 16 years before. The journey took weeks, and the conditions on the moon were harsh beyond description, but Marcus would not be deterred. They found the crash site exactly where Siritha had described it. The wreckage preserved by the airless vacuum in almost perfect condition. 5,000 bodies lay scattered among the debris, frozen in the moment of their deaths. Waiting for someone to bring them home, Marcus walked through the wreckage with tears freezing on his face. He found fragments of the ship he had traveled on as a child. He found personal belongings that had belonged to passengers he could barely remember. He found the emergency pod that had saved his life, still bearing the scars of Siritha's desperate efforts to keep him alive. And somewhere in that frozen graveyard, he found the remains of his parents. He could not identify them individually after so many years, but he knelt in the place where they must have died, and he spoke to them across the void of death. "I survived," he said. "I survived because someone chose to save me, and I have tried to honor that choice every day since. I hope you would be proud of the man I became. I hope you can forgive me for not being able to remember your faces. I hope you know that I loved you even when I could not recall why." He had brought something with him to leave among the wreckage. A small crystal that Siritha had given him before she died. It was a memory stone, a piece of Velithari technology that contained her complete recollection of those 3 days when she had nursed a broken human child back to life. Every moment of struggle and fear and hope and determination had been encoded in that crystal. Every whispered promise and gentle touch and desperate prayer had been preserved. It was her gift to him and to the families of those who had died, and to anyone who might one day wonder what had really happened on this frozen moon. Marcus placed the crystal among the wreckage and said a final goodbye to the parents he could not remember and the queen who had given him a second chance at life. The expedition recovered every body they could find. They brought them back to human space and gave them proper burials with full honors. The families of the Prometheus rising finally had closure after 16 years of wondering and grieving and hoping against hope. And Marcus Cole became something more than a symbol. He became a bridge in the years that followed. He devoted himself to building connections between humanity and the Velithari, established exchange programs that allowed young people from both civilizations to learn about each other. He created foundations that funded joint research into the Fondua gravitational anomalies that had caused the tragedy so that no other ship would suffer the same fate. He spoke at schools and universities and military academies about the importance of looking beyond fear and seeing the person on the other side of any conflict. He never forgot Siritha kept her memory stone with him always, and sometimes in quiet moments he would activate it and listen to her voice describing the 3 days that had changed both their lives. She had been afraid. He learned from those recordings. She had been uncertain and overwhelmed and convinced that she was making terrible mistakes, but she had kept going anyway, because giving up was not an option she could accept. That was perhaps the most important lesson. She had taught him courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was choosing to act despite the fear. Courage was looking at an impossible situation and deciding to try anyway. 50 years after Siritha's death, a monument was erected on a border world called New Harmony, where human and Velathari territory finally officially met in peace. Monument depicted two figures reaching toward each other across a void, a young alien princess with bioluminescent tendrils and a human boy with a scar on his face. Marcus Cole was 93 years old when he attended the dedication ceremony. His scar had faded with age, but it was still visible, still marking him as the boy who had been saved by an act of impossible kindness. His great-granddaughter stood beside him, a bright-eyed girl of 12 who reminded him of himself at that age, and beside her stood her best friend, a young Velathari barely past their first molting, their chitons still soft and their compound eyes wide with wonder at the ceremony unfolding before them. Great-grandfather, the girl asked as they looked up at the towering monument, is it true that you actually knew the queen? Marcus smiled at the question. I did, he said. She saved my life. Why? The young Velathari asked, their voice carrying the same harmonic resonance that Marcus had heard in Siritha's words so long ago. It was the question that beings on both sides had debated for half a century. Why? Would a Velathari princess risk everything to save a human child? Why would she choose compassion over safety? Why would she make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life? Marcus looked at the two children standing before him. Human and alien, impossible friends in an impossible future that Siritha had helped create. Because that is what people do, he said, when they choose to be more than the universe expects. The two children exchanged glances and then ran off together toward the memorial gardens, laughing in two languages that had once seemed incompatible. Marcus watched them go with tears in his eyes and joy in his heart. Above him the stars wheeled on in their ancient patterns, vast and cold and indifferent to the small stubborn creatures who insisted on filling the darkness with light. And somewhere beyond those stars, Marcus liked to believe, a queen was watching, smiling in the way that her kind smiled, proud of the choice she had made so long ago and grateful that she had lived to see what it became. The universe was cold, but they did not have to be, and that made all the difference.